we have to start the show talking about the latest big breach. 100 million Capital One customers have had their data hacked. It included 140,000 social security numbers and 80,000 bank account numbers, and it was all reportedly done by one Seattle-based hacker who bragged about the hack on social media. Our own Brian Cheung is here with more on the story. Hey, Brian.
Hey, morning.
So what's the deal? What should Capital One customers be doing this morning? How concerned should they be?
Yeah, so, I mean, the dust is still kind of settling, but Capital One had a statement yesterday saying that they would be spending about $100 to $150 million on trying to make this up to customers, offering them some credit monitoring services. No details yet on exactly how customers can sign up for that.
So $1 million per person.
not per
That's
person.
The investment.
Well,
but if there were 106 million people who actually potentially hacked, yeah.
Right. It's possible, and we'll see. That's the spend that could also cover legal costs, for example,
yes.
other issues.
I was being flipped.
Yeah, but regardless, I mean, a colossal amount of people, 100 million in the U.S., 6 million in Canada. This covers credit card accounts, but also those who applied for credit cards. Which means even if you don't have a Capital One credit card, if you applied for one at some point, there's a chance that your name, address, other types of information might be floating out there. Again, not everyone had their social security information hacked, but obviously still a pretty bad situation. And Capital One says that they'll be notifying their customers when they do have the protocol in place for how they can check and make sure that they weren't affected by the.
So the story behind the story is, I think, even more fascinating, unfortunately. We don't want to make light of it, of course. However, the former AWS engineer who basically put it on blast saying, wow, look at what I have done. Can you explain more of how that ended up happening and what are the repercussions for her?
So the culprit appears to be a 33-year-old Paige Thompson. She was arrested in Seattle by the FBI yesterday. She's currently in custody and will have to go through criminal proceedings. But she was a former employee at Amazon AWS, wasn't an employee at the time of her arrest. She worked there between 2015 and 2016. It was about a year or so. But obviously, during the time that she was there, she amassed a wealth of knowledge about how the AWS coding works, was able to use that knowledge to basically do what it's kind of she was fishing for a user ID and password, if you will, the equivalent. They actually call it an access key and a secret key that you use to actually access the data that's stored by a company at AWS. She was able to force that from the files that were stored by Capital One at Amazon servers, and then use that to download the information of 106 million accounts. So there's a lot of questions here about what the due diligence was on behalf of Capital One to stop this from happening, right? Maybe they could have done a better job of protecting their user ID and password. Maybe, the password could have been different. There's a lot of kind of nuances here, but it seems like there's also some culpability, at least on Amazon's part, in the way that this hacker was able to basically use the vulnerabilities that she was aware of, right? Because she, again, worked at AWS to get into the company and steal all this information.
And I think that's what's so unique about this hack is I don't recall seeing the cloud tied to any of these recent big hacks. And I think that begs the question, with the rise of the cloud, what are these big cloud players doing to ensure that either outsiders don't break in or, in this case, allegedly an insider?
Absolutely. That's a great point. And for what it's worth, I mean, the cloud has experienced a number of hacks before. So actually in 2017, WWE, World was a wrestling entertainment, they actually had exposed about 3 million accounts because of an issue that they had in terms of the way that they configured their cloud storage at AWS. And Verizon, which is actually our parent company, had also breached between actually above 6 million accounts in 2017, the same year, because of issues as well. In both of those cases, it appeared that it was their configuration problems that actually left open consumer data for anyone to take. It's unclear if anyone actually took it. In this case, a little different because it was a hacker that the FBI actually caught who forced Capital One, to basically fish their user ID and passwords to steal all this information. So, the details of this are a little different than they were in the past.
We're watching the stock move lower. Maybe you could argue surprising, it's only down 6%, but it is moving lower live as we talk. Now let's bring in another guest to join us in this discussion about the Capital One hack. That is Jeff Bardin. He is the Chief Intelligence Officer at Treadstone 71, joining us from Fort Myers, Florida. Hey, Jeff.
Morning, how are you?
Good, thanks for coming on. Well, we were just talking about the hacker and that sort of interesting part of this. What's your take, especially because you have the Amazon Web Services involvement because of the hacker and because this does involve cloud, as my colleague just brought up. What do you make of this hack? A little bit different than some of the other giant hacks of the last 3 years that have made such headlines.
Yeah, it's a lot different. There's a few things that stand out for me. Is one, the background of Paige Thompson in load balancing in Amazon Web Services. That gives an insider's viewpoint of how AWS works. and all the different components that are part of this. Number one. Number two, that the other thing that stands out to me is the use of iPredator and Tor in these. These are standard lulsec tools from back in 2011, tools that they used in pretty much all their hacks. A little bit different there that this wasn't picked up because iPredator is a standard, or was a standard tool for use for VPN access to exfiltrate data, and it was always triggered. If you saw iPredator in your log files, it was noticed that you were in trouble. The fact that that was in the cloud, whether it was a virtual private cloud or however they had this configured, is definitely concerning, because Capital One has devoted so many resources to storing their data in the cloud, using content networks to actually load balance and distribute all of their content to their users. So it's definitely of concern here, regardless of how they've configured it. The web application firewall access and gave this individual pretty much root to everything they had.
Hey, Jeff, Brian Cheung here. So obviously kind of an interesting situation here with Amazon and also Capital One here. And obviously we still need to hear about some more details beyond what we saw in the criminal complaint. But based on what you've seen, I'm wondering, what does the culpability look like on Capital One and Amazon, given that maybe Capital One could have done a little bit more to secure the user ID and password, if you will, that ended up getting stolen by this person who had pretty good knowledge of AWS. But then on the other hand, obviously this was an employee who knew exactly what the vulnerabilities were. So maybe there's due diligence for Amazon to have patched it up before this became an issue.
It's a good point. It's hard to say exactly what the configuration was, but the fact that you have a WAF role account that was, in my view, it doesn't seem like it was monitored. This is an account that is a trusted account, and trusted accounts are the ones that should be monitored for activity. And when someone starts to get into that account, it should trigger some notices in their log files and their SIMs that something unusual is going on, but obviously it didn't trigger it because this person was caught because of their own failure of operational security. So there could be negligence there on Capital One's side for not monitoring internally trusted accounts, which is a standard mistake. Most of what they do is intrusion detection, intrusion prevention, to look at attacks from the outside, and they're not looking at the possible insider threat. So once the account was accessed, they pretty much seemed to have access to anything they needed to do what they wanted.
So, Jeff, how do you prevent either current employees of a company from engaging in this kind of activity and these kinds of breaches, or former employees? It seems like this is a really hard code to crack for companies across the board.
Well, I tend to disagree with that, because I think a lot of it is rooted in basic configuration and change management activities. One, root accounts should never be accessed unless it's through a change management procedure, something that's pre-approved and validated in a test environment, and then when they are actually executing it, it's turned on and then turned off after the actual change is executed. So I think some of that is rooted in this. On the other hand, firewalls are always changing and shifting, but when an account like that is accessed, it should trigger something automatically. It should be monitored, it should be tracked, it just as a standard protocol. So I don't think it's that difficult. On the other hand, there's a lot of hands in the cookie jar sometimes. There's so many people looking at things, changing things. Things are fluid. And lots of times, information security is put on the back burner as applications are changing regularly in an environment that's made for agile development, continually pushing out new changes, while security sometimes takes a back seat.
Yeah, one of the people who did get her hand stuck in the cookie jar is Paige Thompson. When you think about the hacker and the reasons that she wanted to get caught, you rightfully point out that it's not necessarily monetization efforts at face value. Why do you think this anger, this vitriol really manifested this way? And how do you prevent a lot of these other kinds of disgruntled employees from doing something similar?
It's hard to say. I mean, it's been a couple of years since Paige actually worked at Amazon on this, so who knows what's underneath the covers. It could be a combination of a lot of different psychological factors. So it's hard to say. On the other hand, when someone leaves your environment and they have had access of this type to your environment, anytime you do an automatic changeover of passwords and you shift and adjust your controls based on those people coming and going, that should be a standard rule set that you put in place. So I think that can be done. On the other hand, she didn't use a password. She found some sort of a hole in the environment that maybe she had learned through understanding Amazon's CloudFront tool sets, their Aurora tool sets, their content distribution network, all their different load balancing activities that she had been participating in to set this up, assuming as well that maybe she had been involved in setting up the Capital One environment. So it's hard to know, as things move so fast, what little holes are there. And who knows, maybe a backdoor was installed beforehand. We don't know. It's unlikely 3 years later, but it's hard to say at this point. There's a lot of speculation, but a changeover, when someone leaves that has access, there should be an automatic changeover. And that's sometimes hard because people come and go frequently, and there's a lot of contractors involved as well.
All right, we'll have to wait and see what happens next and what Capital One does, especially with pressure coming from customers that they